Hi guys, so I'm on the floor today to talk to you about all the books that I read in February. I read 6 novels, 2 short stories, and 1 poetry book, and I'm going to talk about all of them. A lot of the books that I read in February were mainly for school. I didn't really have time in February to read for enjoyment, so a lot of the books that I'm talking about today are books that I have read for school. I'm going to jump right into Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. I read this book for my post-colonial literature class, and I really liked it. I technically read this in January, but I finished it in February, so I'm going to include it in this video. Essentially, this book tells the story of Okonkwo and his village in Africa and their downfall once the British colonizers come in and take away their land. For the majority of the novel, we're not hearing anything about the colonizers yet, and it's mainly just focusing on the village of Umuofia, where Okonkwo is from, and we learn a lot about his family, his village, the traditions, and Okonkwo's downfall. And it's really excellent. I freaking loved this book. The prose is very simple and straightforward, but it gets the point. One of the huge themes about this book is masculinity and how in Okonkwo's village, masculinity is respected. The way Okonkwo talks about his own masculinity is very toxic, if you ask me. Like, he's beating his wives. He calls one of his sons a girl all the time because he's weak. He's not as strong as Okonkwo would like, and he eventually leaves the village of Umuofia to join the Christians. But even though Okonkwo does have his faults, I really felt for him, especially towards the end when the whites come in and colonize the village of Umuofia. It's a really sad book, and we get to see how detrimental colonization is to this village in Africa. And it's absolutely horrible at how they're converting them to Christianity and essentially destroying the entire village while they're doing it. Right before reading this, we read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and those 2 books are quite different from each other. One's written by a white man and one is written by a black man. And the descriptions of the African people are very different from each other. This one humanizes them more, which I really appreciated. I just really appreciate getting the chance to read this book because I haven't read a lot of books about colonization, especially one from a non-white author, and so I really enjoyed this book and I really appreciated it. This is a great book, I recommend. Next, I've talked about this book before, but I read Inward by Yung Pueblo, which is a poetry book that talks about loving yourself, accepting yourself, and healing and so on. And I hated it. I hated every part of it. It was boring, it was bland, it was repetitive. I don't even want to call it poetry because it was so basic. The ideas are so simple and repetitive that it's kind of just hammering the same basic overdone idea over and over again. It's basically like a Pinterest board filled with inspirational quotes, and it was boring. I read it and it was like, been there, done that. I've heard of these things before. It's not anything new, not anything creative. It's basically as if Yung Pueblo took inspirational quotes, added line breaks, and then called it poetry. Really bad. I really don't recommend it. It's horrible. It's awful. One thing that I really like about poetry is that it discusses themes and humanity in such interesting ways, because poetry is a lot more experimental than, let's say, novels. And that's why I really like reading poetry, just because it's so much more experimental. But this was just basic. It's so bland, and I hated it. I haven't read a lot of poetry, but I will say Ocean Vuong is one of my favorite poets. He writes poetry books like Time as a Mother and Night Sky with Exit Wounds, and I personally really liked those. Yung Pueblo has nothing on Ocean Vuong, so I hated Inward. Don't recommend it in a million years. The next story that I read is a short story. It's called The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. And this was good. It was harrowing. As I was reading it, it's kind of like you have a feeling of impending doom in your stomach, like you know something bad is gonna happen, but you just don't know what it is. And it kind of made me really anxious. Basically, if you don't know, The Lottery is about a small town who gathers every year to participate in a lottery where people pull papers and decide who wins the lottery. Winning the lottery isn't necessarily a good thing in this book. I will just leave it at that. And it's just really haunting because everyone kind of goes along with it. It's kind of like mob mentality where no one really questions the traditions that you're doing. No one really questions what's really happening until Tessie, she constantly repeats over and over, this isn't fair. It's not fair. Why are we doing this? It's not fair. And just the repetition of that line is really scary because it makes you question what's going to happen to her. And it kind of gave me anxiety. It's not really long. I think it's like 8 pages long or something, but it's really, really good. And I really liked this horror story. Shirley Jackson is like an icon in the horror genre. I think this is the first story that I read from Shirley Jackson. I will definitely read more because I really, really liked this one. Next up, I read Moth Smoke by Mohsin Hamid. Moth Smoke is about a man named Daru Shehzad who lives in Pakistan, and he is put on trial for a crime he may or may not have committed. And it centers on him and his story and how he interacts with different people and sort of his ideas on social status, social class, and things like that. This entire book is structured in a sort of court trial case where you are quite literally the judge in the book, and we hear different testimonies from different people, including Daru, Ozzy, who is Daru's best friend, and Mumtaz, Ozzy's wife, and Daru's lover. And different testimonies like that. And you as the reader have to decide whether or not Daru is guilty for this crime or not. And it's a really, really interesting read. I really, really liked this book. I especially really loved the social commentary in it and how Mohsin Hamid uses air conditioning as a symbol of social class. He spends an entire chapter talking about how air conditioning is how rich people manipulate the environment for them, and how in Pakistan and essentially everywhere around the world, people are divided into 2 groups, people who have AC and people who don't have AC, people who can manipulate the environment and people who can't. And that's what I found really, really fascinating about this. He's a great writer. Daru is such an interesting character. He's so unique in his perspective and views on life. He's a very bitter man, but he's bitter for a reason. There's a character in here, Ozzy, Daru's best friend, and he's absolutely insufferable. I hate the man. He's so annoying. But I think that's just a sign of good writing. Mohsin Hamid is a genius. This book is great. I really, really liked it. So thank you, Mohsin Hamid, for writing such a good book. I also read another short story, and this one is by Joyce Carol Oates, and it's called Where Are You Going? Where Have You Gone? And it's about a 15-year-old girl named Connie who is home alone one day when a random stranger named Arnold Friend shows up in her driveway and tells her to come with him so that he can show her what love is like. I'm taking a horror class right now, and a lot of the stories that we've read so far weren't really scary, just because I had this belief that words can't really scare me, like they're just words on a page. But this one was actually really, really harrowing and really, really scary in the way that Oates was describing the dynamic between these 2 characters and how Connie is slowly losing her agency against this random man in her driveway. And it's really haunting, and my heart was racing while reading this story. Arnold is just a really creepy man. He's really weird. And throughout the story, you're telling Connie, no, you can't go with that man. You can't leave with him. But the more you read, the more you realize that Connie loses her ability to choose. She loses her agency, and it's really scary. That's all I gotta say. If you're looking to get scared, I highly recommend that short story. I loved it. The next book that I read is a very long novel, and I read it on my Kindle. It's Playworld by Adam Ross. Playworld is about a child actor named Griffin Hurt who is in his teens. I think he's about 14. And it takes place in the 1980s, and we see Griffin Hurt fall in love with a 36-year-old woman named Naomi Shah. It's a huge expanding novel on more than just that. It talks about how Griffin Hurt is a child actor and how he's interacting with all these different actors, and also wrestling. He's a huge wrestler. Throughout the story, we see Griffin constantly interact with a lot of different adults. He's very intertwined with the adult world. The more you read it, the more you realize that adults are basically children. They act kind of like children, and the novel kind of shows how the two were quite similar to each other. And I won't give anything away, but a lot of the actions that take place in the novel, you kind of question, who's the adult here? And they're constantly teaching Griffin bad things, or incorrect things, I should say. And they're showing him what it's like to be an adult, but it's not really the best advice. This novel really blends the line between adult and child really, really well. One of the youngest characters in this book is named Oren, and I believe that he's literally one of the most mature people in this book. I think he's like 12 years old or something, but he's so mature. He talks like an adult. He's not really like the other adults in this book. I will say, it was really, really long. I think it's over 500 pages or something, and you can definitely feel it. The descriptions are insanely long. Adam Ross loves to go into detail about every little thing. There's one scene where we get a page-long description of Griffin's dad ironing a shirt. Like, I didn't really need that, but thank you, I guess. It's still a really good book, though. I just read it at a time when I didn't really have enough time for reading, and so I guess that's why it took me so long to get through it. But I think if I had a bit more time and I was able to get through it faster, then I would have enjoyed it more. But I still really enjoyed it. I liked the story. I thought it was great. Now, the next book that I read is a graphic novel. It's Victor LaValle's Destroyer. I don't think graphic novels are the medium for me. Essentially, if you don't know what Destroyer is about, it's essentially continuing the story of Frankenstein. It centers around one of Victor Frankenstein's descendants named Dr. Baker, and she kind of goes off the rails. After the death of her son, Akai, she essentially makes another monster, just like Frankenstein. She turns Akai into a sort of robot monster creature. It's basically a story about identity and how society impacts or inhibits your ability to become your full potential, especially because Dr. Baker is a Black woman living in 1900s America, extremely racist, extremely segregated time of America. I think the ideas are really, really fascinating. It's a very ambitious novel, but it's also really, really short. So the authors tried to pack a lot of huge themes into so many little pages, and to me it kind of felt a little rushed and overwhelming, and I feel like a lot of the ideas needed to be fleshed out a little bit more, and so I didn't really like that. This story constantly switches back between past and present and moving between narratives and moving between perspectives, and it kind of gave me whiplash. Like, slow down. I literally wanted to just slow down a bit, but it moves so quickly. And that's kind of the one gripe I had with this book. And also it's a little confusing. I guess looking at pictures and trying to figure out what's happening is just a little confusing for me. Like, looking at pictures is so much different than reading a novel or watching a movie. I don't know, I guess I'm just not used to the medium, but that's just me. It really is a good exploration on racism and American society at the time. I just don't think it was done the best that it could be done. The next book that I read is a phenomenal one. Intimacies by Katie Kitamura. It's probably going to be one of my favorite books of 2025 if I'm going to be honest. Intimacies is about an unnamed narrator with a lot of different identities and languages who decides to upend her life from New York and move to The Hague, where she works as an interpreter in the International Court. I think for most people, this book will probably be boring just because not a lot happens, but I really, really liked the insight on a lot of different themes. One of my favorite themes to read about is language and the use of language and the nature of it as well. And this book describes it so beautifully. Because the narrator is an interpreter, her job is quite literally words. And so she has really interesting insights on the power of language and its restrictions and shortcomings. And the book acknowledges it. And at the same time, it's able to overcome those shortcomings. One of the things the narrator says is that there are chasms between words and languages. And her job as an interpreter is to make sure that the gap is as small as possible. And when you're an interpreter, It is not your job only to translate the word itself, but also to translate the subtleties, the connotation, the underlying meaning of each word that is used. And that's why the job itself is so intimate. This novel also talks about what it means to be intimate with another person. How do you become intimate with another person? And one way that the narrator describes is intimacy is achieved when you go past the language barrier. To gain intimacy, it's not what's said between people, it's what's left unsaid. Simply understanding someone without having to say anything is possibly one of the biggest demonstrations of intimacy between humans, and I love the exploration of it, especially because language is so limiting in its exploration of intimacy. The way Kitamura describes dialogue and conversation in this book is just exquisite. She dives deeply into the connotation of what is said in every single word. And it's so fascinating because not only are you hearing what these characters are saying, you're also hearing about what they're implying and what they actually mean in the subtext. And that's what makes each conversation in this book seem so much more intimate. And you feel like you're actually there talking to these characters. And I loved it so much. This book is genius. It's brilliant. I'm obsessed with this book. I'm obsessed with Katie Kitamura. This is the first book I read of hers, and I can't wait to read more. But alongside language, she also talks about society and the nature of the justice system because she works at the International Court. And a lot of what she says about the justice system and the court is that it's essentially a theatrical performance. The whole thing is just a theater play. People are sort of putting on acts in order to determine who is good, who is evil, what is good, and things of that nature. It also talks a lot about society and how there are cracks within society, and we see the cracks. We see the bad things that are happening, but we choose to ignore it. It's just a book that makes you question kind of your whole life. Not to be dramatic or anything, but this book is so incredible, and in about 250 pages, it explores so many broad themes, and it does it so incredibly well. And this is a kind of book where you would definitely get more out of the second, third, fourth time reading it. So I'm definitely going to pick this book up again because I just think it's so, so incredible. Thank you, Katie Kitamura. I love you. The last book that I read in February was actually a book that I finished last night, and it's Boy Parts by Eliza Clark. This book is essentially about an unreliable narrator. It's about a girl named Irina who kind of goes insane. Irina is essentially exiled from the art world and taking a sabbatical from her bar job, and she goes around recruiting different boys and takes explicit pictures of them and then also does really horrible things to them after. And the more you read, the more gruesome it gets. This is a very dark and filthy and gruesome and gory book that I don't really recommend everyone to read just because it does have really dark subject, but I really, really liked the idea. It's kind of like American Psycho if the main character was a woman. It also has underlying themes of gender, of class, of power dynamics, and it's really, really good, and I really, really liked it. Essentially, because a lot of media is portrayed within the male gaze, meaning that the male is the subject and women are the objects for men to be viewed upon, Irina takes her art and her photography as a way to subvert the norm. So she's taking pictures of these men in a more submissive position, a more feminine position, and making them the object rather than the subject. I loved the exploration of power dynamics between men and women and how Irina tries her hardest to get away from that power dynamic, but she can never really seem to escape it. But it's also really, really dark. When I was reading this book, I kind of got an upset stomach, I'm not gonna lie. It made me feel like I was reading something I wasn't supposed to. It made me feel quite uneasy, but I think that's the goal of the book. The goal of the book is to make you feel uncomfortable, and it succeeded, and it's a great book. And that's it. I will say, a lot of this was just reading for school, which I didn't hate because a lot of the books that I did read for school were actually quite nice. But I think it was a successful reading month overall. I read a lot of great books, one 5-star, which was this one. This is my only 5-star. And one really bad book, and it was a poetry book. Young Pueblo, please. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. If you wanted to read my full reviews on each book, they will be down below in my Goodreads. So thank you so much. Bye, everyone.